Well, howdy, Pastor Josh here. We are at the site of the ancient city Colossae. Now, I'd asked the group, it was a trivia question of whether or not the Apostle Paul ever visited the church here at Colossae. Now, just think about it, because this is the question I would ask you. Did Paul ever visit Colossae? What would you say? Well, if you said that he visited, you might be wrong, because what we see in the letter to the Colossians is that he had heard of their faith. So he had not experienced them or had met them personally, but they had a faith that was alive, that was abundant, that had really reached the ears of the Apostle Paul. And so he writes a letter to encourage them. So let me just ask you this question, is like, have people heard about your faith? Do you have a faith that is actually public? Do you have a faith that actually intersects with your life, that is demonstrable, that there's something that is transformational about what you believe? Because here at the church of Colossae, the church of Colossae, they had a faith in Jesus that actually had transformed them. Now, one of my favorite phrases is actually found in the book of Colossians, and it is in verse 13, chapter 1. For he has rescued us from the domain of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves. In some translations, it talks about how God has transferred us from the domain of darkness into the kingdom of his beloved Son. And so I love that phrase, because when we put our faith in Jesus, there is this transference. There is this transition from death to life, from the domain of darkness into the kingdom of life. So when the people here, when men and women put their faith in Jesus, what Paul is telling them is this theological understanding that you now have a new kingdom that you are part of. And then he goes on to even describe how this king that you have now, that you worship, listen to this, he is the son of the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. So think about this. So they're living in an area where, just not too far from here, we were there yesterday at Hierapolis, that you had the cult of Apollo. Well, you had all of these gods, and none of them had created. And what Paul is saying to them is that now this king that has died for you, that has rose from the dead, now him that we proclaim and we have our faith in, he's the actual image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. He's the actual one. He is the Logos, the word that spoke the world into existence. That's who your faith is in. Just think about that. So as they're reading this letter, how things, because let's just start panning around and looking at the creation. And so this God, this king that you have your faith in, that has died and rose from the dead, he's the one who's created all of this. Absolutely mind-boggling. The other thing that I would say about the letter to the Colossians is that it contains actually my life verse. And my life verse is actually found in chapter 3, verse 1 through 4. So since then you have been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Then he says, set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. For you have died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. And verse 4 says, when Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will also appear with him in glory. Think about that. Is that, you're going to set your heart, you're going to set your mind on the things that are above. You're going to set your heart and your mind on Jesus. Why? Because he is your life. You see, whatever your faith is in, that truly is your life. Whatever you have faith in, confidence in, trust in, belief in, that is going to be the object in which your life orbits around. And so what Paul is saying to these believers here in Colossae is that when Christ, who is your life, when he comes back, guess what? You will appear with him in glory. And so now there's a completely different paradigm shift for these people. And that paradigm shift is that there's something after this life. Why? Because you're part of this new kingdom. You're part of the kingdom of God made possible by Jesus' death and resurrection. And so when he's coming back, and when he comes back, you will appear with him in glory. Let me ask you this. Do you have that kind of faith? Like, do you have that kind of faith in Jesus? That's why I get little goosebumps standing here reading the letter to the church at Colossae, knowing that almost 2,000 years ago, they received a letter from the Apostle Paul teaching them about their faith, making sure that their faith was rooted and grounded in Jesus. And just as I close, is what's fascinating is that after he explains who Jesus is, making sure that they understand how their faith in Jesus is really the grounds of their transformation, is then he's going to talk about how your faith in Jesus actually transforms areas of your life. It's going to transform how you parent. It's going to transform how you see your marriage. It's going to transform how you work. It's going to transform how you see other people. Because that's ultimately what faith in Jesus does. It transforms not just us and our relationship with God and reconciling us to God, but it actually transforms every sphere and every area of our life. Blessings.